On March the 17th, 1943, in a quiet wood-panelled office in Berlin, a German admiral held a report that seemed impossible. It was a single sheet of paper, a summary of raw intelligence, but its contents were more explosive than a 1,000-pound bomb. The report didn't describe a new superweapon or a secret army. It described a factory, an American factory an ocean away, that was projected to soon be capable of producing a 4-engine heavy bomber every 60 minutes. To the men of the German High Command, it was a joke, a piece of American propaganda so absurd it was laughable. But to the spies who risked their lives to gather the information, it was something else entirely. It was a death sentence written in numbers. It was the day they knew with chilling certainty that the war was lost. This is the story of the devastating truth that was too terrifying for Adolf Hitler to believe, and how the denial of a single fact sealed the fate of the Third Reich. In the heart of the Nazi war machine, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris was an oddity. As head of the Abwehr, German military intelligence, he was a man who lived and breathed cold, hard facts. Unlike the fanatics who populated Hitler's inner circle, Canaris was an old-school professional. He was a career naval officer, a patriot from a different era who saw the world not through the warped lens of Nazi ideology, but through the clear glass of strategic reality. His loyalty was to Germany, and his duty was to provide the unvarnished truth, no matter how ugly. Canaris had been involved in intelligence operations since the First World War, when he conducted sabotage missions in Spain, Morocco, and even the United States. After the war, he navigated the treacherous political waters of Weimar Germany, building a reputation as a skilled and reliable intelligence officer. By the time Hitler took power, Canaris had already established the Abwehr as Germany's premier intelligence organization. But as the Nazi regime's true nature became clear, Canaris's respect for cold facts and strategic reality put him increasingly at odds with Hitler's obsession with racial ideology and military destiny. His organization, the Abwehr, was a sprawling network of agents and analysts stretching across the globe, the eyes and ears of the German military. In the early years of the war, the Abwehr had been key to Germany's blitzkrieg victories, delivering the intelligence that let the Wehrmacht outsmart its opponents. But by early 1943, the mood in Berlin was changing. The war wasn't a series of victory parades anymore. The disaster at Stalingrad had been a brutal shock to the system. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet war machine was grinding back with terrifying force. In North Africa, American and British forces were squeezing the life out of Rommel's famed Afrika Korps. The tide was beginning to turn, and yet at the very top, a dangerous sense of invincibility lingered. Hitler, holed up in his Wolf's Lair headquarters, was becoming more detached from the real world, surrounded by yes-men who filtered out bad news and fed his delusions. He believed the German war effort was a matter of sheer will. The German soldier was superior. German science was unbeatable. Victory was destiny. These were not the beliefs of a man open to uncomfortable truths. Into this echo chamber of self-deception, Admiral Canaris was about to pour a bucket of ice-cold water. He was a man who understood the grim arithmetic of war. He knew modern warfare wasn't just a clash of armies, but a collision of economies, a brutal equation of steel, oil, and aluminum. And from his perch at the center of a global intelligence web, he was starting to see numbers that terrified him. Numbers that suggested Germany wasn't just losing the production war. It was about to be buried by an industrial avalanche it couldn't even imagine. The intelligence didn't arrive in a single flash. It was a slow, creeping dread built from a dozen different sources. It started as whispers picked up by German agents in neutral countries. A businessman back from the US spoke of a factory so vast it had its own weather. A diplomat in Washington reported on production targets that seemed to have an extra zero. A Swedish engineer sent a coded message about an aircraft assembly line that moved with the speed of car manufacturing. A Japanese naval attaché, Germany's own ally, sent back reports on American production numbers with a tone of sheer dread. Individually, these reports could be dismissed, but as they flowed into the Abwehr headquarters, Canaris's analysts saw the terrifying pattern emerging. They all told the same story. They all pointed to one place, a massive industrial complex in Michigan called Willow Run. And they all made the same ridiculously impossible claim. The Ford Motor Company was applying automobile mass production techniques to the four-engine B-24 Liberator heavy bomber. The goal was to eventually roll out not one a day, not one every few hours, one every single hour. To the German mind, this was impossible. A B-24 Liberator was a beast, an 18-ton behemoth of aluminum and steel with over 1.5 million individual parts. German factories, the pride of European engineering, took weeks, sometimes months, to produce a comparable heavy bomber like the Heinkel He 177. The idea that the Americans, a nation mocked in Nazi propaganda as a chaotic, racially mixed society, could build such a complex weapon in 60 minutes wasn't just unbelievable, it was insulting. Yet the intelligence was relentless. Canaris and his officers did the math. If the Americans could actually pull this off, one bomber an hour meant 24 a day, over 700 a month from one factory. At the time, the entire German aircraft industry was struggling to produce a fraction of that number in heavy bombers. German aircraft production in 1943 had reached approximately 20,600 military aircraft for the entire year, all types combined, including fighters, bombers, and transports. If Willow Run alone was producing that many bombers, the implications were staggering. The spies confirmed the details. The information was vetted. Some of the reports came from open sources. American magazines like Time and Life published articles about Willow Run with photographs of assembly lines showing serial numbers that German intelligence could track. America published their production statistics openly, even in war bond advertisements. In one advertisement, Americans were told their war bonds had built 317 aircraft from 1940 to 1945, 86,000 tanks, 2.6 million trucks, and 6,500 naval vessels. The Americans weren't even hiding their production capabilities. They were flaunting them. In contrast, Germany treated production figures as state secrets. Workers signed death oaths, promising silence. Factory locations were hidden. Security was obsessive. The very idea that the Americans would advertise their manufacturing prowess in magazines sold at newsstands seemed insane to Nazi planners. It violated every principle of military security. Yet it was precisely this openness that made the Americans' boasts so terrifying, because they had nothing to hide. Half a world away, in Michigan's farmland, the impossible was becoming very, very real. On a stretch of farmland, a monster had risen. It was the Willow Run bomber plant, the physical embodiment of what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. And there was nothing else like it on Earth. Designed by the industrial architect Albert Kahn, the main building was a single room so vast it was called the most enormous room in the history of man. It stretched for over half a mile. The entire complex covered 67 acres under one roof. With 5 million square feet of factory space, it was the largest single-story industrial building ever constructed. To avoid paying taxes in 2 different counties, the assembly line famously had to make a bizarre 90-degree turn, with partially built bombers rotating on giant turntables. This feature, known as the tax turn, was one of the most unusual aspects of the facility's design, though avoiding encroachment on the nearby airfield's taxiways also played a role. But the real revolution was the philosophy inside. Henry Ford, the automotive titan who had revolutionized manufacturing with the Model T, and his production chief Charles Sorensen, had made an arrogant promise. They would build airplanes just like they built cars. The old guard aircraft industry scoffed. "You can't expect a blacksmith to make a watch overnight," one executive sneered. Ford and Sorensen proved them wrong. They deconstructed the B-24 into manageable sub-assemblies. Each worker was trained for a single repetitive task. One person drilled holes. Another riveted a panel over and over. A third welded joints. A fourth applied sealant. This revolutionary approach allowed the plant's apprentice school to churn out thousands of new workers every week. Semi-skilled labour could accomplish what aircraft manufacturers claimed required expert craftsmen. Ford engineers had to perform an enormous undertaking to make this possible. Consolidated Aircraft, the B-24's designer, provided blueprints that were designed for traditional aircraft manufacturing, not assembly line production. Ford's team had to reverse engineer thousands of bomber part drawings, creating miles of new technical schematics. Thousands of specialized machine tools and dies had to be handmade. The challenge was staggering, but Ford's engineers persisted. And who were these workers? They were a direct contradiction of Nazi ideology. At its peak, Willow Run employed over 42,000 people. Nearly a third were women, the iconic Rosie the Riveters, who operated rivet guns and welding torches with the same precision as any man. Rose Will Monroe, a widow who had moved to Michigan from Kentucky with her 2 young children after her husband was killed in a car accident, became one of the real-life inspirations for the Rosie propaganda character. She was discovered while working on the assembly line and featured in a war bonds promotional film, which led directly to the creation of the famous "We Can Do It" poster by J. Howard Miller. Over 9% of the workers were African Americans, and another 3% were classified as disabled. Italian Americans, Polish Americans, Hungarian Americans, and workers from dozens of other ethnic backgrounds worked side by side on the assembly lines. This was the very mongrel society that Hitler loved to mock. Nazi propaganda had spent years portraying such diversity as a weakness, as proof of racial degeneration. Yet these workers, this racial mixture that Nazi ideology deemed inferior, were about to outproduce the so-called master race at a rate that defied belief. Women earned $1 per hour more than many of their fathers had earned at traditional jobs before the war. The work was dangerous and demanding. Women wore iconic headscarves, required as safety precautions to keep hair out of machinery. They worked in shifts, 6 days a week, their collective effort a relentless 24-hour hum of production. Riveting was physically demanding work. 2 people worked together, one operating the rivet gun while another used a bucking bar to set the rivet properly. By 1944, nearly 20 million American women held war jobs, a 57% increase from 1940. Over 6 million women got jobs specifically in war industries. The early days at Willow Run were rough. Initial production was chaotic, and the plant earned the nickname "Will It Run" due to persistent problems. The Army Air Force kept changing specifications for the B-24, and each change required expensive and time-consuming updates to the assembly line. Ford's production methods depended on a fixed design, and constant modifications threatened the entire efficiency model. But as 1943 rolled on, the machine hit its stride. By January 1943, Willow Run produced 31 bombers that met Army Air Force standards. In February, 59. In March, 75. In April, 104. In May, 130. The production numbers kept climbing month after month. Workers learned their jobs. Processes improved through constant refinement. Tools got better as engineers identified and fixed problems. Quality improved with each aircraft, as Henry Ford insisted that rejected bombers be used as learning tools for analyzing defects. By June 1943, Willow Run was producing 190 bombers per month. That was more than double Consolidated's original San Diego factory output, and the rate kept increasing. Raw materials flowed in one end and out the other. An 18-ton heavy bomber emerged, ready to fly, or rather, ready to fly after testing at Willow Run's own airfield, which Ford had built specifically for this purpose. By 1944, the factory had truly hit its stride. In April 1944, Willow Run produced 453 B-24 bombers in 468 working hours. That was more than one bomber per hour. Exactly as Charles Sorensen had promised 3 years earlier, when aircraft industry executives had laughed at his hotel room sketches. By the end of 1944, the monthly production rate had reached 650 B-24s per month. This wasn't propaganda. It was a new kind of warfare, a war of industrial might. And America was unleashing a weapon the Third Reich had no answer for. When the March 1943 intelligence report reached Berlin, the implications were immediately clear to anyone willing to see them. The Americans weren't just building more aircraft, they were building them in a completely different way. They had transformed aircraft manufacturing from a craft into an industrial process. They had done what German industry said was impossible. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, understood the gravity of the situation better than most. He had been brought in to rationalize German weapons production, but even with his organizational genius, he couldn't overcome the fundamental arithmetic of the war. German aircraft production, despite heroic efforts, and the ruthless exploitation of slave labor, simply couldn't match American output. By 1943, Germany was producing approximately 20,600 military aircraft of all types. America, by contrast, was producing over 85,198 aircraft in 1943, more than 4 aircraft for every one Germany produced. In 1944, American production would reach 96,318 aircraft, while German production peaked at approximately 39,170 planes before declining under the impact of Allied bombing. The disparity was overwhelming. Where Germany used slave labor extracted from conquered territories and concentration camps, America used volunteers. Where Germany was decentralized and compartmentalized due to Allied bombing, America's dispersed production network actually made it more resilient. Where Germany had to move factories underground to avoid bombing, America built new factories openly. By the war's end, the United States would produce approximately 300,117 military aircraft, while Germany, Japan, and Italy combined produced only about 207,000. As one Abwehr officer put it, if these numbers are correct, then Germany has already lost the war. It is no longer a question of willpower. It is a question of mathematics. But Hitler would not accept this mathematics. When confronted with reports of American production capacity, Hitler's reaction was denial. He convinced himself that the reports were Allied propaganda, deliberate deception designed to demoralize German planners. He surrounded himself with staff officers who told him what he wanted to hear. Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, had promised Hitler that Germany's air force would be unbeatable. To admit that American aircraft production exceeded Germany's by a factor of 4 or 5 would have meant admitting that the war was lost, and Hitler simply would not do it. This denial would prove catastrophic. American industrial might didn't just provide the Allied forces with more aircraft, it provided them with better aircraft. The P-51 Mustang, produced by North American Aviation at factories in California and Texas, became arguably the best fighter aircraft of World War II, with performance that exceeded anything Germany or Japan produced. With Mustang escorts, bomber losses dropped dramatically, while German fighter losses increased. American factories weren't just producing aircraft. They were producing better aircraft faster than anyone thought possible. Meanwhile, German efforts to increase production became increasingly desperate and increasingly brutal. Albert Speer, trying to expand aircraft production, worked with Fritz Sauckel, Hitler's manpower dictator, to obtain workers. By 1943, Sauckel had supplied over 1.5 million voluntary labourers, forced labourers, prisoners of war, and concentration camp prisoners to work in German war industries. The SS provided 64,000 concentration camp prisoners specifically for weapons production projects. Workers who feigned illness, slacked off, sabotaged production, or tried to escape were denied food or sent to concentration camps. By 1944, over 500,000 workers were arrested for production-related infractions. Underground factories where prisoner labourers worked became death camps, with corpses piling up faster than crematoriums could process them. Despite these measures, despite the use of slave labour on a scale unprecedented in history, Germany could not match American production. The mathematics were inexorable. An American factory could produce more aircraft in a month than Germany could produce in 3 months. Willow Run alone produced 8,685 B-24 bombers during the war, more heavy bombers than many entire nations produced. Ford produced 70% of all B-24s that saw combat, and Ford produced half of all B-24s ever built. Admiral Canaris himself had attempted to prevent this industrial catastrophe. In 1942, acting under Hitler's direct authorization, Canaris had launched Operation Pastorius, a sabotage operation aimed at American industrial capacity. 8 German agents, all of whom had lived in the United States and spoke fluent English, were trained in explosives and sabotage techniques at a special school near Berlin. They were instructed to destroy aluminum manufacturing plants, power plants, railroad bridges, and other targets vital to the American war effort. 2 groups of agents were transported to America via submarine. The first group landed on Long Island on June 13, 1942. The second landed at Ponte Vedra Beach, Florida on June 17, 1942. They came equipped with explosives, incendiary devices, timing mechanisms, and detailed plans for their sabotage campaign. The mission was given the highest priority and the full resources of the Nazi intelligence apparatus. But Operation Pastorius was a disaster. One of the agents, George John Dash, had apparently intended to defect from the moment he was recruited. He turned himself in to the FBI within 2 days of landing and revealed the entire operation. The FBI launched its largest manhunt to that point in American history and captured all 8 agents. After a secret military trial, 6 were executed for espionage. The operation had failed completely. The failure of Operation Pastorius caused Hitler to rebuke Admiral Canaris severely. It also marked the effective end of German sabotage attempts on American soil. The Germans realized that American security and American resources simply exceeded their capacity to disrupt. No sabotage operation could slow the relentless tide of American production. Admiral Canaris faced an impossible position. As head of German intelligence, he was responsible for providing accurate, objective assessments of Germany's military situation. By 1943, the facts were clear. Germany was losing a war of production against an enemy with vastly superior industrial capacity. The mathematics of manufacturing capability were more decisive than the bravery of German soldiers or the innovation of German engineers. But Hitler would not accept this reality. When Canaris presented accurate intelligence assessments that contradicted Hitler's strategic assumptions, the Führer would rage at him for demoralizing the high command. Hitler began to lose faith in the Abwehr entirely. He accused Canaris of deliberately providing false or misleading intelligence. He questioned the admiral's patriotism and his commitment to Nazi victory. Unknown to Hitler, Canaris's doubts about the regime had deepened into active opposition. While conducting intelligence operations, Canaris was simultaneously working with German army conspirators plotting to assassinate Hitler. He facilitated contacts between German plotters and British intelligence. He provided information about German defensive preparations in Normandy to the Allies before D-Day information so accurate and so valuable that American intelligence officers marveled at its precision and reliability. Colonel James O. Curtis, the American intelligence evaluator on Eisenhower's staff, later noted that Canaris's reports were consistently graded as A1, the highest possible classification for intelligence reliability. But these acts of resistance could not change the fundamental reality that Canaris understood in March 1943. The war was mathematically lost. The factories of America had already decided the outcome. The B-24s rolling off the assembly line at Willow Run, one every 63 minutes by 1944, represented an industrial capacity that Germany simply could not match. While German aircraft plants were being systematically bombed and moved underground, Willow Run sat openly in Michigan, expanding production and setting new records month after month. The report of March 17, 1943, was not the first intelligence assessment to reach Hitler's desk showing American industrial superiority, but it was a definitive statement of a terrifying fact. The war had become a war of production, and America was winning by a margin so vast that no amount of German tactical skill or strategic planning could overcome it. In 1943, American steel production alone reached 81 million tons, compared to Germany's 30 million tons. American aircraft production exceeded 85,000 aircraft, compared to Germany's 20,600. American tank production reached 37,198 tanks, compared to Germany's 11,600. American truck production had reached 2.6 million vehicles. In every single category of war production, America was producing more, producing better, and producing faster than Germany. This wasn't the result of any single innovation or breakthrough. It was the result of a mobilized economy, massive capital investment in new factories and equipment, and a workforce that included women, African Americans, immigrants, and disabled workers, all the groups that Nazi ideology considered racially inferior. The arsenal of democracy was built not by the pure, racially superior German race, but by the mongrel, chaotic American democracy that Hitler spent years mocking. By 1944, even Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments genius, understood the hopelessness of the situation. Speer later wrote about the moment when he fully understood the magnitude of American production. The final consequence was mathematically certain: the loss of the war. He realized that with American factories producing 96,318 aircraft in 1944 alone, while Germany produced only 39,170, the outcome of the war was no longer in question. It was only a matter of time. The report of March 17, 1943, had contained a message that Hitler could not accept, and a truth that he would deny until the moment of his suicide in 1945. The war was already lost. not through military defeat, but through industrial incapacity. Not because German soldiers lacked bravery, but because German factories could not produce the weapons needed to fight an enemy with vastly superior industrial might. Admiral Canaris, who understood this mathematics so clearly, would be arrested after the failed July 20th, 1944 assassination plot against Hitler. He was executed in April 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender, becoming another casualty of a regime that could not tolerate the truth. The Willow Run bomber plant, where 8,685 B-24 Liberators were produced, almost half of all B-24s built stands as a monument to a different kind of power. Not the power of racial superiority or authoritarian control, but the power of mobilized democracy, industrial innovation, and human diversity. The women riveters, the African American workers, the immigrants, the disabled, all the workers that Nazi ideology deemed inferior proved through their labour that industrial democracy was more powerful than fascist ideology. When the last B-24 Liberator rolled off the Willow Run assembly line on June 28, 1945, the war was already over. But the result had been decided years earlier on March 17, 1943, when a German admiral held a single sheet of paper describing a factory in Michigan that was changing the course of human history. It was the day the German spies knew, with mathematical certainty, that the war was lost.